looks like we're in Silicon Valley, but we're not. We're in Washington, D.C., and I'm with the co-founder and head of global strategy at 1776, an incubator, one of the most prominent incubators in the world, Brandon Pollack. Brandon, welcome to Innovate 2016.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Brandon, looks like San Francisco, but it isn't. We're in D.C. Is there a third way? I know you guys are very much focused on the intersection of politics and technology.
Yeah, so I really think that as we've kind of seen, startups are everywhere, right? They're not just limited to Silicon Valley. They're not just limited to New York or a few major tech centers, but they're right here in D.C., which is why you feel if you're anywhere in Washington like 1776, you're going to feel just like you're in San Francisco.
But 1776's focus is investment in areas outside the consumer internet, business areas where government has a role. Is that correct?
That's right. So our focus are on world-changing startups that are in deeply entrenched sectors of the economy. Anything that really touches government is highly regulated. So areas like education and energy, healthcare, transportation, smart cities, really these kind of sectors that we look at as kind of this next wave of not only investment, but how do you utilize those really unique connections of resources of Washington, D.C. to help these startups in these sectors all over the globe.
So these are areas which require or need or request regulation?
Yes, those are the areas that we focus on are highly regulated.
In other words, the reason why 1776 is based in Washington, D.C. is because of your access and connection with government.
Well, that's part of it, but I think if you kind of step back, we're almost 3 years old, and the reason why we're in Washington, D.C. is actually a couple of reasons. One, because you didn't really have a central hub for the startup community here in Washington. A lot of entrepreneurs were working out of Starbucks, and there was maybe a few co-working spaces. But when we looked at it, as I mentioned, because we see that these incredible world-changing startups in these highly regulated sectors are all over the globe, well, what better place also to launch that than Washington, D.C., where you not only have the federal government, but virtually every embassy and corporation, think tank, and association, that deep industry expertise that's here.
And not only that, Brandon, but of course you have a front seat on the 2016 election, which,
that's right.
As you said to me before this conversation, is the weirdest one you've ever lived through. So what's going on?
Definitely the weirdest one I've ever lived through. As a former political strategist and campaign veteran myself, I got to say it's quite unique. Here you started with 17 plus candidates fighting it out. You had governors, but it turns out that you have a businessman from New York who is taking his way to close to the nomination.
So, Brandon, what are we to make of it from an innovation point of view, from 1776's point of view, from the point of view of TechCrunch or a show like Innovate 2016? What has the election taught us so far? It doesn't seem as if our issues of changing the economy in a profoundly positive way, it doesn't seem as if these issues are playing any kind of role.
They really haven't. I think you've seen a couple of candidates throughout the process, like Senator Rubio. Who
died? I mean, every time he brought up the sharing economy, he got less votes, right?
Well, I think part of it turned into trying to get in the weeds with Donald Trump that did him in at the end. But I think, he talked about the sharing economy. He went to places that were not Silicon Valley to talk about his ideas for, either less regulation or talking about how we're, what is the future of work look like. And then you had Martin O'Malley, while polling only at 1%.
Who was on the show.
who's a great guy and certainly focused on civic tech.
But does the failure of O'Malley, the failure of Rubio, the absolute absence of any serious conversation about any of these issues amongst the major candidates, does that point to the fact that most Americans don't care about this stuff?
I don't think they don't care. I don't think that's the issue. And I don't think it's been based on a lack of particular traction, right? Like, you haven't seen the candidates talking about net neutrality and deep in the weeds issues that are not major campaign issues. I think right now what you're starting to see is that you're going to have, people like Secretary Clinton, who, when she was secretary, did have, an innovation agenda at the State Department, as global diplomacy. I think you'll see more of her kind of gravitating.
So what would you like to see from the point of view of the kind of investments you're making at 1776 in healthcare, in education, in transportation, in energy? What should be being discussed?
Well, I think you kind of see, like, from a venture capital perspective, like, how are we going to create the best landscape so we maximize the number of investors? You look at some of our investments, like around, we have one company that's an Uber for kids who has to deal with transportation regulation and different state level issues.
More or less a regulation, Brandon. Is that the solution? Do we need to see the state, the government back off all this innovation, or should they be more involved?
I think it has to be balanced. I think you need smart regulation. No one industry.
Examples of smart regulation that's working at the moment? Is the regulation now reshaping the transportation business and Uber? Is that working?
I think you've started to see that work. I think different markets at first, with Uber, for example, they went into different markets. They had one particular strategy, which was just coming in, disrupting the market. And now I think you're seeing a change where a lot of state and local officials are aware of that type of strategy, and now you're seeing an adjustment. So I think what you're seeing is different types of regulations at the state and local level passing. And at the federal level, I mean, everything around drones. I mean, that is going to be one of the biggest issues going forward, is how do we deal with drone technology?
How has the Obama administration performed? What grade would you give them in the innovation sphere?
I would actually give them an A.
An A?
I would give them an A. And here's the reason why. Prior to this president, there really wasn't any kind of innovation focus. If you look at what the president's done since he's been in office, you've had the U.S. Digital Service, you've had Startup America, you've had 18F at GSA, you've had everything from initiatives like White House Demo Day to Startup Day Across America to kind of this acknowledgement around entrepreneurs. I mean, they've had champions of change focusing on entrepreneurs, whether they were in healthcare or education or veteran entrepreneurs. So the reason why I would give them an A is if you go away from the regulatory environment, you look at what they've done, they've been extremely proactive connecting with entrepreneurs around the country.
You give them an A on net neutrality and Title II?
I think that they are doing a very good job on those fronts.
So we need more regulation in that area?
I don't think we need more regulation on net neutrality. But I think by and large, I'd give them an A from the standpoint of how they're trying to engage with the innovation economy.
And what's your forecast on either a Trump or a Clinton presidency? Will Trump continue in that Obama tradition of getting an A in innovation?
He hasn't been talking that way so far. When you're getting into a war on Twitter with Jeff Bezos and knocking Mark Zuckerberg, you're not necessarily setting yourself up for warm relationships.
Do you worry about him? Do you worry that much of the progress under the Obama administration is going to be destroyed if he became president?
It's hard to say at this point. Who knows? It could be he's saying one tune because it's a Republican primary, but then once you shift to the general election, it's totally different.
And what about Hillary? She hasn't said that much. There have been one or two signals that she gets it, but do you think that the kind of issues that you care about, that TechCrunch viewers care about, is it going to be prominent for her in the general?
I think so. I think she started to talk about the importance of technology, and so for example, recently she talked about how do we fight extremism, and how do we enlist tech leaders to do that. I think you're starting to see that she's been talking more and more about the innovation economy, and I think as she pivots towards the general election, you'll see more of that engagement with entrepreneurs, talking about major issues around human capital, access to capital. So I think you'll see a shift to that.
Well, finally, Brandon, pivot your mind to November 2016, 6 months' time. What are we going to see?
I think we're going to see, if anything has told us so far in this election, that anything can happen.
Anything can happen. Perfect non-answer. Brandon Pollack, real honor to have you on the show.
Thank you.
And congratulations with all the excellent work that 1776 continues to do.
Great, thanks for having me.